Welcome to a world where the rain whispers secrets and shadows hold untold truths. Tonight, let my voice guide you through a tale that lingers at the edge of reality, a story of mysteries too dark to uncover, of spirits trapped between worlds, and of sins that refuse to be forgotten. Relax, close your eyes, and let the soothing sound of rain accompany you as we journey into the unknown. Story 1, The House of Sins. There's a house in a small, unassuming town that no one dares to enter. Its windows, long boarded up, are said to hide secrets too dark to face the light of day. The locals call it the House of Sins. It stands at the end of a narrow street, overshadowed by gnarled oak trees that seem to claw at the sky. Even during the day, it feels cloaked in shadow. It wasn't always this way. Decades ago, the house belonged to a man named Edward Carter. He was a respected doctor in the community, known for his charm and generosity. It began with his obsession with understanding the mind. Edward believed that the human psyche was like a machine, one that could be repaired, rewired, or even dismantled. This belief, coupled with his ego, convinced him that he could cure the incurable by pushing the boundaries of medicine and morality. At first, his experiments were subtle. He would administer small doses of untested drugs, carefully observing how his patients reacted. But when his results failed to satisfy his curiosity, Edward became impatient. He began isolating his patients for days at a time, depriving them of food, water, or even light. He believed that breaking their spirits would allow him to rebuild them in his vision of sanity. Soon, the treatments escalated into outright torture. Edward constructed crude devices designed to test the limits of human endurance. A chair outfitted with restraints and electrodes became the centerpiece of his basement. He would force his patients to endure hours of electric shocks, their screams echoing through the walls. He justified these actions as necessary steps in his research, scribbling notes in his journals with chilling detachment. Patient displayed increased compliance after prolonged exposure to sensory deprivation. Signs of irreversible trauma noted, acceptable collateral. He grew increasingly detached from humanity, seeing his patients not as people but as puzzles to be solved. He recorded every reaction, every scream, every moment of despair. His journals became a grotesque catalogue of human suffering. Subjects' resistance faltered after 7 hours. Significant cognitive deterioration achieved. Experiment deemed a success, but it wasn't just the physical torture that defined Edward's depravity. He played with the emotions of his patients, exploiting their deepest fears and insecurities. He would promise them freedom, only to revoke it at the last moment, watching with cold fascination as hope drained from their eyes. One of his most infamous cases involved a young woman named Margaret. She had been committed to his care after suffering from severe depression. Edward convinced her that he could cure her, but instead, he isolated her in a pitch-black cell for weeks. When she begged for mercy, he would whisper through the walls, pretending to be her deceased mother. Margaret's cries for her mother's forgiveness still haunt those who dared to live near the house. As Edward's experiments grew more heinous, he began to document his own transformation. In his final journal entries, he wrote about hearing voices, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He dismissed them at first, attributing them to his overworked mind. But as the days wore on, the voices became more insistent, calling his name, accusing him, mocking him. They know what I've done. They see me. They won't stop. But I must finish my work. Over time, whispers began to spread. Patients who entered the house were never seen again. The townsfolk noticed strange noises coming from the property late at night, cries, whispers, and sometimes, laughter that didn't sound quite human. But Edward was powerful, and his reputation protected him. No one dared to investigate too closely. Then one fateful night, the house fell silent. For weeks, no one saw Edward or heard the usual sounds coming from the house. When the authorities finally entered, what they found shook the town to its core. The basement was a labyrinth of cells, each containing evidence of unspeakable acts. Journals detailing his experiments lined the walls, each one describing the breaking of a human spirit in clinical detached detail. And in the center of it all was Edward's body, slumped in a chair, his face twisted in a mask of terror. The official report claimed he had taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of his crimes. But locals tell a different story. They say the spirits of his victims rose up against him, dragging him into the darkness he had created. After Edward's death, the house was abandoned. Over the years, a few brave, or foolish, souls tried to move in, but none stayed for long. Each reported the same phenomena, voices whispering in the night, cold hands brushing against them, and an overwhelming sense of dread that grew stronger with each passing day. One family lasted less than a week. They claimed their young daughter began speaking to someone she called the Weeping Man. She said he lived in the basement and cried because he couldn't escape. They left without even packing their belongings. Others reported seeing Edward himself, wandering the halls, his face still frozen in that horrifying expression of guilt and terror. The house seemed to feed on their fear, growing darker and more oppressive with each new tenant. Today, the house stands as a grim monument to Edward's sins. The town has tried to sell the property, but no one dares to buy it. Some believe that as long as the house remains standing, the spirits trapped within it can never find peace. There's one final detail that many locals don't share, perhaps out of fear of what it might mean. On certain nights, if you stand close to the house, you can hear the faint sound of laughter, Edward's laughter. Some say he's still there, trapped alongside his victims, doomed to relive his sins for eternity. Others believe he's not trapped at all, but watching, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to step inside. So, if you ever find yourself on that lonely street, staring at the crumbling facade of the Carter house, ask yourself, would you dare enter? Story 2, The House Across the Street. It was a cold November night when I first noticed it, the house across the street. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but something was different that evening. The wind had picked up, swirling around the trees and rustling the leaves, and as the sun began to set, I felt an unsettling chill in the air. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows down the empty road. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone when I glanced out the window and saw the old house. It stood there, just across the street, a tall, decaying building with broken windows and faded paint. The house had always been empty, or at least, that's what I thought. It had been years since anyone had moved in, but tonight something was different. I felt a strange pull, an inexplicable compulsion to look at it longer. I watched as the curtains in one of the upstairs windows fluttered. But no one had ever lived there. At least, that's what everyone in the neighborhood believed. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it was as if the house was calling to me. I got up from the couch, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cold evening air. My feet carried me instinctively across the street, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't the type to go snooping around empty houses, but something had drawn me in. As I approached the gate, I hesitated. The iron fence was rusted and covered in ivy. The house itself looked even more menacing up close, its crooked shape towering above me, the roof sagging in places, and the once bright windows now dark and obscured. The front door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I don't know why I went inside. It was as if some unseen force was pushing me forward, urging me to cross the threshold. My heart raced, my palms grew sweaty, and I swallowed hard. But I walked in. The house was cold. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I stepped into the entryway, my footsteps echoing loudly on the hardwood floors. The house groaned with the weight of its age, the floors creaking beneath me as I ventured further inside. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and a thin layer of dust covered every surface. It was the kind of place where time had stood still, and the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. The upstairs window where I had seen the curtains move now stood still, dark and uninviting. But there was something about it, something just out of sight, that made me want to go up there. I didn't know why. The feeling grew stronger as I moved through the house. Almost as if it were alive, breathing, watching me. Up the stairs I went. Each step groaned beneath my weight, and the walls seemed to close in around me. When I reached the top, I could see the door to the room where I had seen the curtain move. It was closed now, but I knew I had to go in. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight streaming in through the cracks in the window blinds. There, in the center of the room, sat an old rocking chair. It creaked softly, as if it had been rocked by someone, or something. The air was heavier here, the temperature colder, and then I saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. A woman. Her face was obscured by dark hair. And she wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind that looked like it belonged to another time. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. But I could feel her eyes on me, cold and empty. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, to leave the house, to get as far away from her as possible. But my feet were frozen in place. I couldn't move. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, just the sound of the chair creaking again, as if she had rocked it with the slightest of movements. Then, with a sudden jerk, the chair stopped. I tried to turn and leave, but as I stepped toward the door, something stopped me. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but there was no one there. I didn't know what to do. The house seemed to be closing in on me. The walls felt tighter, the shadows longer, and the woman in the corner, she was still there, her head tilted slightly, as if she were waiting for me to understand something. I tried to speak again, to ask her why she was here. But my voice failed me. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, echoing in my mind, telling me to leave, to run before it was too late, but I couldn't move. The woman's figure shifted then, her head slowly rising to meet my gaze. Her eyes, dark, hollow, and empty, met mine. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that she wasn't just a figure in the house. She had been here for years, trapped in this place, unable to leave. As I stood there, frozen in place, the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen and twist. The air grew thick with a heavy, oppressive energy, making it hard to breathe. The woman's figure seemed to grow more distinct, her features sharper in the moonlight. Her dress, old, tattered, and faded, hung from her like a shroud. Her hair, long and black, framed a face that had once been beautiful but was now pale and gaunt, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in decades. She didn't speak, but I could feel her presence all around me, suffocating me with her silent gaze. My heart was pounding in my chest, my pulse quickening with every passing second. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't respond. My eyes were glued to her, trapped in the cold emptiness of her stare. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost inaudible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Why are you here? I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. The air felt thick with fear, and I couldn't gather the strength to respond. I had heard stories about haunted houses before, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror I was experiencing now. This was real. She was real. The woman took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. Her movement was slow, deliberate, almost like she was gliding across the floor. I could feel the chill emanating from her, a cold that seemed to seep into my bones, making every inch of my body ache. You should never have come here, she said, her voice now a little louder, filled with a quiet sorrow. This house, this place, it's not meant for the living. I swallowed hard, trying to force words past the lump in my throat. What happened here? Who are you? The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes flickered to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to dance and shift unnaturally. The rocking chair began to move again, creaking softly as if being rocked by an invisible force. Then, she spoke again, her voice colder this time, tinged with bitterness. My name is Evelyn, she said. I was once like you, alive, full of hopes and dreams. But that was a long time ago. Her words were slow, deliberate, as though they were a memory she had carried for years, something that had weighed her down. I could feel the sadness in her voice, the deep sorrow that seemed to pour from her very soul. I was young, she continued. I had a life, a family. But it all came crashing down, because of the things that were done in this house. The things my husband did, the things I let him do. I could feel her pain, her anguish, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. But I didn't understand. What had she meant by that? What had her husband done? Evelyn's eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the torment there. The house seemed to groan, as if it were alive, listening to her every word. Do you know what it's like to be trapped? She asked, her voice a soft whisper now, barely audible above the creaking of the house. To live in a place that holds your soul captive. To know that you'll never escape. I have been here for years, decades, and I am still here, because of him. I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around me grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. There was something about her words that felt wrong, as though they were meant to keep me here with her forever. Who? I asked. My voice trembling. Who did this to you? Evelyn's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, the sadness was replaced by something darker, something much more terrifying. My husband, Thomas, she spat. He was a monster, a man who loved nothing more than his own power. He did things, terrible things in this house. Things that should never have been done. And I allowed it. I stood by him, thinking it would stop, that it would change. But it never did. The room seemed to close in around me as she spoke, and I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. I wanted to back away, to run, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. We lived in this house for years, unaware of the evil that had taken root within it. But then I began to see things, strange, unsettling things. Shadows moving on their own. Voices in the night. And the more I ignored them, the worse they became. I watched as Evelyn's face contorted with rage and regret. The rocking chair in the corner started moving faster now, creaking and groaning as though it were being rocked by an unseen hand. Thomas didn't believe me at first, she said, her voice sharp with bitterness. He thought I was losing my mind. But one night, he saw it too. The things we had ignored, the things we had let fester. And when he saw them, he couldn't handle it. I felt a chill run through my body, and I took an involuntary step back. There was something in her tone now, something that made me afraid to hear the rest of her story. Thomas, he didn't try to fight it. No, he embraced it. The evil that was in this house, the darkness that had been festering for so long, it took him. And I didn't stop him. Her words hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of her guilt. I could see the torment in her eyes. The regret of her past choices. He killed me, you know, she whispered, her voice barely audible now. Not with his hands, but with his neglect. With his silence. And after that, the house took me. It took me, just like it took him. And now I am a part of it. Trapped here, forever. The air in the room grew heavier as Evelyn's voice began to grow faint, almost as if she were drifting into a trance. Her eyes glazed over, lost in memories of the past, yet her presence remained palpable, suffocating the very space around us. It wasn't always like this, she murmured, her tone almost wistful, as though she were reminiscing about a time long forgotten. There was a time when this house was a home. A place where laughter filled the rooms, where light streamed through the windows, and warmth radiated from the hearth. We were happy once. I stood still, unable to tear my gaze away from her. Her sorrow was almost too much to bear. It felt as though she was unraveling something deep within herself, pulling me further into her world, a world that no one should ever have to enter. We had everything, Evelyn continued, her voice trembling with emotion. But greed, ambition, and secrets, those things destroy people, slowly but surely. My husband, Thomas, became obsessed with the power this house held. He thought he could control it, but the truth is, no one controls something like this. A sudden gust of wind blew through the open window, causing the curtains to flutter, but Evelyn didn't seem to notice. She stood frozen in place, her face now twisted in anguish, as if she were reliving the worst moments of her life. It was after he made the deal, she whispered. The deal with the thing in the basement. That's when everything changed. The darkness in this house, it didn't start with us. It was here long before we ever stepped foot inside. But he thought he could bargain with it, control it, make it his ally. But the darkness, it's not something you can bargain with. It consumes you. It twists you. I felt my heart rate quicken. My mind raced, trying to process everything she was saying. What deal was she talking about? What had her husband done? Thomas started bringing strange people here, she continued, her voice now tinged with fear. People who spoke in languages I didn't understand, who came to the house at night, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in ways that no one should ever look. They would gather in the basement, chanting, performing rituals. I begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He thought it would make him more powerful, more influential. And he didn't care who or what he had to sacrifice. Evelyn's words hung in the air, like the whispers of some forgotten nightmare. I could feel the weight of her grief, the crushing sense of helplessness she had experienced during those dark years, but something happened one night, she continued, her voice breaking. Something I couldn't explain. A scream, a terrible, blood-curdling scream, echoed from the basement. It was so loud, so full of pain, that it shook the entire house. I ran down there, desperate to find Thomas, to make him stop whatever he was doing, but when I got to the basement, he was gone. The room was empty, except for the shadows that seemed to shift and twist in the corners. And then I saw it, the thing. The air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as Evelyn's words sent shivers down my spine. She paused, as if gathering the strength to continue. It was a creature, no, not a creature, a presence. A thing that lived in the shadows, feeding on fear and darkness. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any kind of animal I'd ever seen. It had eyes, eyes that glowed like embers, and they locked onto mine. And in that moment, I knew Thomas had made a terrible mistake. I felt the room shift around me, the floorboards groaning as though the house itself were alive. Reacting to her story. The shadows seemed to stretch, inching toward me as if trying to consume the light. After that night, I tried to leave, Evelyn said softly, her voice almost a whisper. But the house wouldn't let me. The thing in the basement, whatever it was, had attached itself to me. It kept me here, in this place, trapped in this house with no escape. And the worst part. I realized too late that it wasn't just Thomas who had been consumed by it. It was me, too. I had been slowly losing myself, my sanity, bit by bit, without even knowing it. Evelyn's face contorted with agony, her expression now one of deep despair. I couldn't leave. I couldn't escape the house. And then, one day, I found myself standing in the middle of the basement, staring at the same shadows that had taken Thomas. I realized then that I had become part of the darkness, that I had been marked by it. The room seemed to grow darker still, the very air thick with the oppressive weight of her words. I could feel the presence in the room, the thing that Evelyn spoke of, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I died in this house, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But my soul never left. It was trapped here, just like the others who came before me. And now I am bound to this place. I can never leave. The wind howled outside, the sound of it rattling the windows, but inside the room, there was a strange, unnatural silence. I could feel the chill creeping deeper into my bones, the sensation of being watched, of being trapped with something ancient and powerful. You need to leave, Evelyn's voice cracked, a note of desperation breaking through her sorrow. You need to leave before it takes you to. The house wants more. It always wants more. And it won't stop until it has claimed everything, everyone. I could see the terror in her eyes, and for the first time, I understood. She wasn't just warning me, she was pleading with me. But even as I turned to leave, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, pulling me back. "No," Evelyn whispered. "You can't leave. Not yet." I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my shoulder, its touch sending a jolt of fear coursing through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, heart pounding. The room had gone eerily silent, save for the relentless sound of my own heartbeat. Evelyn's eyes widened, filled with something I couldn't name. Her face twisted in horror as her fingers clutched my arm tighter. "It's not her," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "It's the house. It's trying to keep you here." I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadowy corners of the room and the oppressive atmosphere that thickened with every passing second. The dim light from the old chandelier flickered, casting long, sinister shadows along the walls. My pulse raced as I turned back to Evelyn, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. It was too late. The house had already marked me. The air grew colder, colder than I thought possible. The walls seemed to close in around me, the room growing tighter, more suffocating with each passing second. I took a step back, but it felt as though the floor itself was pulling me down, threatening to drag me into the very depths of the house's malevolent embrace. "Don't listen to it," Evelyn's voice crackled. "You have to fight. You have to leave now." I backed away from her, terrified, my mind racing. I knew she was right, something had changed. The house wasn't just an empty shell of haunted memories. It was alive, a living, breathing entity that fed on fear and despair. And it wanted me. It wanted me to stay, to become one with it, just like all the others. I glanced at the door. The way out was still there, still an option. But I wasn't sure how much longer I had before the house claimed its hold on me completely. As I reached for the door, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned and creaked, as though the house itself was protesting, unwilling to let me go. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open, no. I shouted, pulling at the handle with all my strength. But it was useless. The door was sealed shut. My breath came in shallow gasps, panic rising in my chest. Behind me, I heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. But it wasn't the kind of darkness you could escape. It was a living thing, a darkness that consumed everything it touched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, slithering and twisting as if they had a mind of their own. I could feel them closing in on me, suffocating me, trapping me in this nightmare, and then I heard it, the softest whisper, almost too quiet to hear. It was a voice, but not Evelyn's. It came from somewhere deeper within the house, from the very walls themselves. "You are ours now," it hissed, the voice cold and cruel. "You will never leave." My heart pounded in my chest, and I stumbled backward, my back slamming into the wall. I felt a sharp pain shoot through my spine, but I couldn't focus on it. I could only hear the voice that was now coming from all directions, surrounding me, pressing in on me. "You're already one of us," the voice whispered again, this time louder. "You've been marked. The darkness knows you, knows everything about you." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the terror, but it was impossible. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, more insistent. I opened my eyes, and that's when I saw it, a figure in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows. At first, it looked like a man, but there was something off about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. And then, I saw his eyes. They were glowing, bright, fiery red, and they locked onto mine. The man, if he could even be called that, took a step forward, and with every movement, the room seemed to darken, the air growing thicker, heavier. I could barely breathe. "Thomas," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The figure didn't respond. He just moved closer, his glowing eyes never leaving mine. I felt the urge to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air around me was holding me in place, keeping me trapped. The figure reached out, his hand a twisted, gnarled thing, fingers long and claw-like. I could feel the cold radiating off of him as his hand hovered just inches from my face. The moment his fingers brushed against my cheek, I felt a surge of ice-cold energy flood through me, seizing my entire body. I gasped, unable to breathe, unable to move. The pain was unbearable, like my soul was being ripped from my body. "Evelyn," I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, help me." But Evelyn wasn't there anymore. She had vanished. In her place, there was only darkness, suffocating and overwhelming. "Evelyn." I called again, my voice frantic, but it was no use. The house had swallowed her whole, and now it was coming for me. The figure towered over me, his red glowing eyes burning into mine. His hand, gnarled and cold, reached for me. I felt the excruciating chill as his fingers hovered near my face. My heart raced, each beat louder than the last, thumping in my ears as if it might burst from my chest. The room grew colder, darker, and the shadows pressed in, crushing my spirit. "Thomas?" I gasped, my voice barely audible. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, and I knew it wasn't Thomas. This was something far worse. His breath was ice, his presence suffocating. The pain intensified as I felt my soul slipping from my body, being pulled into the endless void. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The darkness had consumed every inch of me, and just as I thought I would be lost forever, I heard a sound, an unexpected sound, a door creaking open. It was faint at first, like the echo of a dream, but then it grew louder. Footsteps. Someone was coming. I could barely turn my head, but through the haze of shadows, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. A woman, tall, with long dark hair and an aura of calm that stood in stark contrast to the malevolent energy around me. "Let him go," the woman said, her voice firm, authoritative, yet soothing, like a balm to my tortured soul. The figure, if it could still be called a figure, snarled. But his eyes flickered briefly in confusion. The shadows recoiled, as if they were afraid of her. The woman stepped forward, her presence filling the room with light, pushing back the darkness inch by inch. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've come for him." With every word she spoke, the shadows began to writhe, retreating, shrinking back as if repelled by an invisible force. The figure, its red eyes now dimming, seemed to lose its strength, its form flickering like a dying flame. I could barely keep my eyes open as the woman approached me, the cold retreating from my body with each step she took. She placed her hand on my shoulder, and in that instant, a warmth filled me, like the sun breaking through a stormy sky. "You're safe now," she whispered, and I felt her energy flow into me, healing me, grounding me. The darkness, which had once seemed all-consuming, evaporated like mist under the warmth of her touch. The figure shrieked, a sound that rattled my bones, but it was fading now, retreating into the depths of the house. The shadows no longer had a hold on me. I could feel my legs move again, my arms loosen from their paralysis, with a final, deafening roar. The figure vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but a faint whisper in its wake. "You can never truly escape," but I was free. The woman turned to me and smiled gently. "You're safe now," she repeated, her voice calm and reassuring. "The house has no hold over you anymore." I didn't know who she was, but somehow, in the depths of my soul, I knew she was my savior. She had freed me from the grip of the house, from the nightmare that had been my reality. "Who are you?" I asked, still in shock, my voice hoarse. She smiled, her eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "I'm someone who has been through this before. This house, it's not the first time it's taken someone. But not everyone gets to leave it." As she turned to leave, I found myself following her, needing to know more, needing to understand who she was. I caught up with her by the door, my curiosity overwhelming my fear. "Wait," I called out, and she stopped, glancing back at me. "How do you know all of this? Who are you really?" She studied me for a long moment, her face softening with a mixture of compassion and sorrow. "I know what it's like," she said finally, "to be trapped in a place that seems to swallow you whole. I was once in your shoes, lost, afraid, and desperate to escape. This house, it calls to those with pain, those with regrets. It thrives on fear, on darkness." She hesitated, then continued, her voice lower now, filled with an eerie knowing. "I was a victim here, too. A long time ago. But unlike most, I found a way out. I learned how to fight it. And now, I help others who are trapped, just as you were." Her eyes seemed to cloud over as if lost in a painful memory. "I was drawn to this house because of a deep wound I carried from my past. But I've learned to make peace with it. And I'll keep helping others, as long as I can." I could feel the weight of her words. The truth in them. It was clear that she wasn't just some random passerby, but someone who had a deep, personal connection to the house. "But why didn't you tell me who you were sooner?" I asked, confusion still clouding my mind. Her smile was bittersweet. "I couldn't. You weren't ready to understand. Sometimes the truth is harder to bear than the terror of the unknown. But now I can tell you. I'm someone who has fought the darkness and won. And I'll make sure it never comes for you again." And with that, she turned and walked into the night, disappearing as mysteriously as she had appeared. I stood there, my mind spinning with questions. Who was she? How had she known what was happening to me? And what had she meant by fighting the darkness? The only thing I knew for sure was that I was safe from the house, safe from the horrors that had once consumed me. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting a warm golden glow over the yard, I finally understood. I had been saved by someone who had walked the very same path I had, and found her way back into the light. But more than that, I now had a responsibility to face my own fears, to never let the darkness take hold of me again. And I would honor that responsibility, just as she had. Story 3, The Whispering Walls. You know, I never expected anything out of the ordinary when I booked that farmhouse. It seemed like the perfect escape, quiet, remote, peaceful. A way to get away from the city noise, the endless rush. Just me, alone, surrounded by nothing but nature and the silence of the countryside. But as soon as I walked through the door of that house, something shifted. The place had this old-world charm, sure, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt empty, like it had been abandoned for years. But at the same time, it felt like something was still here. Watching. Waiting. I walked through the front door, took in the dusty air, the faint smell of mildew that lingered in every corner. You know, the kind of silence that's so heavy, it presses on your chest. That's what I felt the moment I stepped inside. The silence of a house that hadn't been lived in for far too long. I pushed the thought aside. I was here to unwind, right? To forget about the stress, the chaos of the city. I should have been happy, but instead, I felt this weight. It was strange. It was as if the house itself was alive, somehow. Watching me, I wandered around the downstairs, trying to shake the feeling. It wasn't much, just the living room, kitchen, and a small bathroom. The furniture was old, worn, but it had this comfort to it. So, I went upstairs. The hallway was long. Too long, I thought. I mean, I wasn't familiar with houses like this. They felt too big. Too isolating. I pushed open a door and found a bedroom, large and spacious. But there was no warmth in it, none at all. It felt like I was walking into a mausoleum, something frozen in time, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something. At the very end of the hall, there was a door. But it wasn't like the other doors. No, this one was slightly ajar, almost like it was waiting for me to open it. I should have known better. I should have left it alone, but my curiosity, well, it got the better of me. I pushed the door open. What I found behind it wasn't a room at all, but an attic. The air was thick with dust, and everything smelled stale, like no one had been up there in ages. There was a small window, just a sliver of light filtering through. The only thing that stood out in the room was this old rocking chair. And the chair was moving, just slightly, rocking back and forth. It was strange. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe a draft. Maybe the house shifting. But as I stepped closer to the chair, I heard something. It was a whisper. A soft, almost inaudible voice. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I mean, I was tired, right? But then it came again. Clearer this time. Help me. I froze. My blood ran cold. The air felt like it was thickening around me. I spun around, but the attic was empty. No one. Nothing. Just the chair rocking. And yet, I could still hear it. The whisper. It was everywhere. Echoing in my ears. Help me. My heart was pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't okay. And then, as if the house had decided it wasn't done with me yet, I noticed something else. On the floor beneath the chair, half hidden by blankets and old dust, was a chest. It was small, wooden, old, and I don't know why, but it called to me. There was something about it that seemed wrong, like it was never meant to be opened. I should have ignored it. I should have left the house, locked the door, and never looked back. But I didn't. I reached for it. I pulled it open. Inside were old photographs. Black and white. Faded and yellowing with age. The kind of photographs you find in your grandparents' attic, you know. But something was strange about these. The faces in the photographs were scratched out. All of them. Every single face had been marred by dark lines, completely erased, as though someone had deliberately tried to hide them. And that's when I realized, whatever had happened here. It was not something that could be ignored. This was real. I stared at those pictures, feeling like something was reaching out from the dark corners of the room, pulling me into its history. It's haunting. I heard it again. That whisper. But this time, it wasn't soft or pleading. No. This time, it was demanding, leave this place. The words were clear. They were sharp. And they were right behind me. I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest, but no one was there. The air had gone icy. I could see my breath. I could feel it, a cold, unnatural chill. Then, the chair creaked again. But this time, it wasn't just the chair. It was the walls. The house was groaning, creaking. As though it were alive, shifting, stretching, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A tall shadow. It was so tall, in fact, that it didn't seem possible. The figure was moving toward me, but there was something off about it. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was dragging itself toward me. Step by painful step, it stopped just behind me. I could feel it. Its presence. The air thickened. The whispering grew louder. But it wasn't just one whisper anymore. It was a chorus, voices, hundreds of voices, all speaking at once. All begging for something. For help. For release. The shadow loomed behind me. I turned to face it, and that's when I saw it clearly. The face was obscured by darkness, but I knew it was there. Those empty, hollow eyes staring through me, staring into me. I felt a chill run down my spine, a feeling I can't even describe. It was like the air was thickening around me. The whispering, the growling, the scratching sound from the walls, it was all happening at once, and I couldn't breathe. That's when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a figure. A person. A man. He was standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light from the attic window. He wasn't like the shadow. No, this man was solid. Real. Alive. He stepped forward, his face calm, almost serene, like he had been there for years. And when he looked at me, there was something comforting in his eyes. As if he knew exactly what I was going through. As if he had been sent to save me. He didn't speak, but I could hear him in my mind, his voice clear and calming. It's okay. You're not alone. I'm here to help. I felt a surge of relief. The shadow behind me wailed, its form flickering and writhing in agony, but the man stepped forward. His presence seemed to calm the storm around us. Slowly, the shadow started to retreat, fading into the corners of the attic. The whispering stopped, and with that, the air grew still once more. As the shadow retreated into the dark corners of the attic, I felt the oppressive weight in the air begin to lift. My breath steadied, though my heart still raced in my chest. The man, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, looked at me, his expression calm yet unyielding. He wasn't ordinary, I could tell that much immediately. Who are you? I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if deciding whether I deserved an answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resonant, carrying a weight of authority. My name isn't important, he said. What matters is why I'm here, and why you are, too. I frowned, confused. I rented this place. I thought it was just an old farmhouse. Peaceful. Quiet. I didn't know, whatever this is was here. The man nodded as if he'd expected my response. This house isn't just old. It carries the weight of something far darker than you can imagine. And you stumbled into its grasp. He paused, glancing at the chest of photographs I'd uncovered. Or perhaps, it found you. I shivered at his words. What does that even mean? Do you believe in fate? He asked, his eyes locking onto mine. They were sharp, piercing, as though they could see straight through me. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I don't know. I'm not sure I believe in any of this. Yet here you are, he said simply. And this house, it recognized you. It's no coincidence you came here. I opened my mouth to argue, but something about the way he spoke stopped me. There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. He believed every word he was saying, and somehow, I felt the weight of his conviction. So, what is this place? I asked. Why are these things here? And what do they want from me? The man stepped closer to the rocking chair, which now sat motionless in the dim light. He rested a hand on its back, almost reverently, and let out a long breath. This house is a trap, he said. A magnet for sorrow, pain, and rage. Decades ago, something terrible happened here, something so horrific that the echoes of it still linger. And the people who lived here, they never truly left. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The photographs, I said, glancing at the scratched-out faces. They were the family that lived here, weren't they? He nodded. They were. And their story is not one for the faint of heart. I swallowed hard. Tell me. I need to know. He hesitated, as though weighing whether I could handle the truth. But then he began. Decades ago, this house belonged to the Millers, a family of 5. Thomas and Eleanor, the parents, were quiet people, known in the community for keeping to themselves. Their 3 children, Sarah, David, and little Anna, were the same. No one really thought much of them, just another farming family trying to make a living. He paused, his eyes growing darker. But behind closed doors, things were far from ordinary. Thomas was a cruel man. He ruled his family with an iron fist, his anger often exploding into violence. Neighbors would hear screams late at night, but no one dared intervene. Back then, it was considered a family matter. My stomach churned. What happened to them? The abuse escalated, he continued, his voice heavy. Until one night, Thomas snapped. No one knows exactly what triggered it, but the result was unspeakable. He murdered them. His wife, his children, everyone in the house. And when he was done, he turned the gun on himself. I felt the blood drain from my face. And now they're trapped here. He nodded. The rage, the pain, it seeped into the very walls of this house. It became a beacon for restless spirits, for anyone lost in their own torment. And over the years, it's drawn more than just the Miller family. I shivered, my mind racing. So, the shadow I saw, was that Thomas? The man's jaw tightened. No. That was something far worse. My breath caught. Worse? What could be worse than that? He looked at me. His expression grave. When a place like this is steeped in so much suffering, it becomes vulnerable. Other entities, dark, malevolent forces, are drawn to it, feeding on the pain. That shadow you saw. It wasn't human. It's something ancient, something that thrives on fear and despair. I felt like the room was spinning. Why me? I asked, my voice trembling. Why did it pick me? Because you carry pain of your own, he said simply. And pain is what this house craves. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Memories I'd tried to bury for years came rushing to the surface, the loss, the grief, the guilt. It was all too much. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice breaking. I just wanted to get away, to escape. And that's why you were chosen, he said. But now that you're here, you have a choice to make. You can leave and carry this weight with you forever, or you can help put these souls to rest. I stared at him, my mind reeling. How? How can I possibly help? He gestured to the chest of photographs. They're trying to tell you their story. They want to be heard, to be remembered. If you can piece together the truth, you can help free them. But it won't be easy. The shadow won't let you. My heart raced. And if I fail? He didn't answer. But the look in his eyes said it all. I stared at the man, his words sinking in like lead weights in my chest. If I stay and try to help, what happens to me? He held my gaze, unflinching. That depends. The house will test you. It will dig into your memories, your fears, and your regrets. It will show you things that may not even be real, all to break your resolve. If you're not strong enough. He trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. And if I leave? He glanced toward the door, the faintest flicker of unease crossing his face. You might escape physically. But spiritually? Mentally? You'd carry the mark of this place forever. It doesn't let go so easily. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. There was no good option. Either I stayed and risked losing myself in this twisted nightmare, or I left and dragged the darkness of this house into my life, wherever I went. Neither choice seemed survivable. Fine, I said at last, my voice trembling but firm. What do I have to do? The man seemed almost surprised by my resolve, but he nodded approvingly. Start with the chest, he said, gesturing toward it. The photographs are fragments of their story. The answers you need are in this house, you just have to be willing to look. I knelt beside the chest again, my hands shaking as I sifted through the faded photographs. Each one felt like a piece of a terrible puzzle, the scratched-out faces taunting me. The photographs of the Miller family weren't the only ones in the chest, there were others, strangers, their faces obscured or burned away. Who are these people? I asked, holding up one of the stranger photographs. They're others who've been drawn here over the years, the man explained. Some were like you, innocent, unaware. Others came seeking something, answers, power, even revenge. Most of them never left. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. And the ones who did? They were changed, he said, his tone heavy with implication. I set the photograph down carefully and pulled out a faded journal, its leather cover cracked with age. As I opened it, the brittle pages released a faint, musty smell. The writing inside was frantic, the ink smeared in places as though written in a hurry, or under duress. Journal entry, July 14, 1953, Thomas is not himself anymore. I don't know if it's the drinking or something worse, but he looks at us with eyes that aren't his. Even the children feel it. Sarah won't leave her room at night, and Anna cries herself to sleep. I keep praying for a way out, but this house feels like a prison. Sometimes, I hear whispers in the walls. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better. The words sent a shiver through me. She knew, I murmured. Eleanor knew something was wrong. The man nodded. She did. But by the time she realized it, it was too late. The house already had its hold on them. I turned the page, my pulse quickening as I read the next entry. Journal entry, July 20th, 1953, last night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the attic. Thomas was beside me, but I swear I heard someone, or something, moving up there. I didn't dare go check. This morning, I found Sarah's doll on the kitchen table. The strange thing is, I'd locked her room before bed. She swears she didn't leave it there. I don't know what to believe anymore, the attic. The very place where I'd seen the shadow. My stomach churned. What's in the attic? I asked the man, my voice barely above a whisper. Pain, he said simply. The heart of this house is darkness. Despite every instinct screaming at me to stop, I couldn't resist the pull of the attic. With the journal in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I made my way up the creaking stairs. The man followed silently, his presence both reassuring and unnerving. The attic was even darker than before, the air thick and suffocating. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, its beam shaky as my hands trembled. The space was cluttered with forgotten furniture, dusty trunks, and broken toys. And there, in the center of the room, was a trapdoor. I froze. What's that? The man stepped forward, his face grim. The root of it all. If you want to free them, you have to go down there. My throat tightened. What's down there? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, this house is a well of sorrow, and that trapdoor is its deepest point. Whatever you find down there, it won't let go easily. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. If this is what it takes, then I'll do it. He handed me an old lantern, its glass cracked but functional. You'll need more than light, he said, his voice low. You'll need courage. And the truth. The descent into the trapdoor felt endless, the wooden ladder groaning under my weight. The air grew colder with each rung, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, stone chamber. The walls were lined with faint carvings, symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively knew were ancient. In the center of the room was a crude altar, its surface stained with something dark. And there, lying atop it, was a single photograph, the Miller family, their faces untouched. As I stepped closer, the shadows around me began to shift, forming into shapes, faces, twisted and screaming. The voices came next, a cacophony of anguish and rage. The voices surrounded me, a torrent of overlapping cries, whispers, and guttural groans that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Each sound carried a weight of pain so intense it felt like the air itself was pressing against my chest. I clutched the lantern tighter, its warm light flickering as though struggling to remain alive in the oppressive dark. The photograph on the altar seemed to glow faintly, drawing my attention like a magnet. I hesitated, unsure whether touching it would unlock answers, or unleash something worse. The man's voice echoed in my mind, you'll need courage. And the truth, who's here? I called out, my voice trembling. What do you want? The shadows shifted again, coalescing into shapes more distinct, figures hunched and twisted, their eyes empty pits of blackness. One stepped forward, its form more human than the others. Its voice rasped, like dry leaves scraping across stone. You came, it said, its tone a mix of anger and desperation. You came to see what we are. I nodded, though fear threatened to root me in place. I want to help. Tell me what happened here. The figure tilted its head, the movement unnervingly slow. You want to help? It echoed, its tone laced with bitterness. You cannot help the forgotten. You cannot undo what was done. What was done? I pressed, forcing the words out despite the lump in my throat. Was it Thomas? Did he hurt you? A guttural sound, half laugh, half snarl, rumbled through the room. Thomas, he was just a man. The house made him. The house fed on him. It feeds on all of us. The air grew colder, each breath visible as a puff of white mist. I stepped closer to the altar, the lantern casting long shadows across the walls. Then tell me how to stop it, I said. If the house is feeding on you, there has to be a way to end it. The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The house is bound by blood. It said at last. Blood spilled in pain, in hatred. The altar is its heart, and the heart must be destroyed. My eyes dropped to the altar. The stained surface seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The thought of destroying it filled me with equal parts relief and dread. How? I asked, the figure's head snapped toward the lantern in my hand. Light, it said simply. True light. Before I could ask what it meant, the room began to shake. The shadows on the walls surged forward, their forms merging into one massive shape, a towering entity with too many limbs and eyes that burned like embers. The lantern flickered violently, the light dimming as the entity loomed over me. You will not take what is mine, it roared, its voice reverberating through the chamber. They belong to me. The shadows lunged, and I stumbled back, the photograph falling from the altar and landing at my feet. In the glow of the lantern, I saw the faces of the Miller family staring up at me, no longer scratched out, but terrified and pleading. No, I whispered, clutching the lantern tighter. You don't own them. Not anymore. The entity howled, its form shifting wildly, as if struggling to maintain its shape. I dropped to my knees, fumbling to open the lantern's base. Inside was a small reservoir of oil, nearly empty. My hands shook as I poured the last of it onto the altar, the liquid soaking into the dark stains. The entity's rage intensified, its limbs thrashing against the walls. You cannot defeat me, it bellowed. I am the house. I am eternal. Ignoring its words, I struck a match and held it over the oil-soaked altar. The flame wavered in the drafty chamber, but I willed it to hold steady. You're not eternal, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. You're just a parasite. And I'm done letting you feed. I dropped the match, the altar erupted in flames, the fire consuming the photograph and spreading across the surface in seconds. The entity screamed, its form writhing as the light from the fire intensified. The other figures, the lost souls trapped in the house, began to change, their twisted shapes softening, their empty eyes filling with light. One by one, they turned to me. Thank you, they whispered, their voices no longer bitter or anguished. Thank you for remembering us. As the fire spread, the chamber began to collapse. Stones fell from the ceiling, and the air filled with choking smoke. I stumbled toward the ladder, coughing as I climbed back into the attic. The man was waiting for me, his expression unreadable. You did it, he said simply. Before I could respond, the house shuddered violently. We need to get out, he added, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the stairs. Together, we fled the house, the walls groaning as if alive. Once outside, we stood in the yard, watching as the house imploded. Flames consumed it from within, the structure collapsing into itself until nothing remained but smoldering rubble. The man turned to me, a faint smile on his face. You freed them, he said. And yourself. I stared at the ruins, exhaustion washing over me. What happens now? He didn't answer. When I turned to look at him, he was gone, vanished as if he'd never been there. In his place was a single photograph lying on the ground. It was the Miller family again, but this time, they were smiling. I left the property that night, the weight of the house finally lifted from my shoulders. Though the scars of what I'd experienced would stay with me, I felt a strange sense of peace knowing the spirits were finally free. For the first time in days, the air felt lighter. As I walked away, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. In the glow of the moonlight, I thought I saw the faint outline of a man standing among the ruins, watching over them. Watching over me. Story 4, The Last Room. The first time I saw the listing, it felt like a dream come true. A spacious, 6-room apartment in the heart of the city, priced so low it felt like a scam. But the photos showed a charming, airy space with exposed brick walls, tall windows, and hardwood floors. It was everything I'd been searching for. When I called to inquire, the landlord's voice carried an edge of desperation. "It's still available," she said quickly, almost interrupting my introduction. "You can move in tomorrow if you'd like." The urgency in her tone struck me as odd, but the allure of such a bargain outweighed any hesitation. By that evening, the lease was signed, and the keys were in my hand. The apartment was everything I'd hoped it would be: bright, spacious, and full of character. As I wandered from room to room, envisioning where I'd place my furniture, my excitement grew. But my enthusiasm dimmed slightly when I reached the end of the hallway. There, a single door stood apart from the others. Its handle gleamed as if polished regularly, but no light seeped from underneath it. When I tried the knob, it turned easily, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though it were sealed shut from the inside, an unnatural resistance holding it firmly in place. I mentioned it to the landlord during the walkthrough. "That room's been like that for years," she said with a practiced nonchalance. "The previous tenants never used it. It's best left alone." Her response felt rehearsed, like a line she delivered many times before. But I wasn't about to let one stubborn door ruin my excitement. Every old building has its quirks, I told myself. That night, the apartment was eerily quiet. I wasn't used to the stillness. The absence of city noise felt almost unnatural. I chalked it up to the thick walls, grateful for the reprieve from my usual symphony of car horns and distant sirens. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint knocking sound, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. At first, I thought it was coming from my front door. I waited, heart pounding, but there was no follow-up. No voice calling out, no movement in the hallway. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing, a neighbor, perhaps, or the building settling. But deep down, I felt it. The sound hadn't come from the front door. It had come from the sealed room. Over the next few days, I settled into the apartment, arranging my furniture and unpacking boxes. Yet no matter how much I tried to focus on my new beginning, the sealed door lingered in the back of my mind. The knocking returned each night, always at the same time. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. One evening, as I sat at my desk working, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like being submerged underwater. I turned toward the hallway, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement, something dark and shapeless slipping beneath the crack of the sealed door. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the landlord. My voice trembling with frustration and fear. "Look, I don't mean to sound paranoid, but there's something wrong with that sealed room," I blurted out. "The knocking won't stop, and last night—" "Stop," she interrupted, her tone sharp and cold. "You're imagining things. The room is just an old storage space. Leave it alone." Her words were final, but her voice betrayed her. She knew something she wasn't telling me. Determined to uncover the truth, I dove into the building's history. Hours spent combing through dusty library archives and obscure online forums revealed a chilling tale. The apartment had once belonged to Henry Grayson, a reclusive artist who gained notoriety in the 1940s for his macabre paintings. Neighbors described him as an eccentric loner who rarely left his home. In 1948, Henry vanished without a trace. No body was ever found, but rumors spread of strange occurrences in the apartment. Subsequent tenants reported hearing disembodied whispers, seeing shadows move across the walls, and, most disturbingly, the same rhythmic knocking that had plagued me, the sealed door, it turned out, had been locked by Henry himself shortly before his disappearance. My research led me to an elderly woman named Mrs. Carmichael, who had lived in the building during Henry's time. She was reluctant to speak at first, but when I mentioned the knocking, her demeanor shifted. "You've heard it, haven't you?" she whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "The knocking from the last room." She told me about Henry's final days. He had become obsessed with his work, convinced that his paintings were a gateway to something beyond human comprehension. He spoke of shadows that whispered to him, promising inspiration but demanding sacrifices in return. Before he vanished, he confided in Mrs. Carmichael, telling her that he had trapped something in the last room, something that should never be released. Despite the warnings, I couldn't resist the pull of the sealed door. Armed with a crowbar, I approached it late one night, my hands trembling. The air around the door felt colder than the rest of the apartment, and the knocking grew louder with each step I took. As I wedged the crowbar into the doorframe, the knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, with a final, splintering crack, the door swung open. The room beyond was suffocating, filled with the stench of decay. Dust covered every surface, and the faint outlines of Henry's artwork adorned the walls, distorted faces, twisted bodies, and dark, chaotic landscapes. At the center of the room stood an easel, its canvas blank except for deep, claw-like scratches. A massive mirror hung on the far wall, its surface cracked and clouded. As I stepped closer, my reflection seemed wrong. It moved independently, tilting its head and smiling, a sinister, mocking grin. The mirror began to vibrate, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs. Whispers filled the air, growing louder until they became a deafening roar. Suddenly, the reflection spoke. "You shouldn't have opened it," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl. The room began to shake, the walls bending and warping as shadows poured from the mirror. I stumbled back, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Just as the darkness closed in, the door burst open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Mrs. Carmichael, clutching a rosary and muttering prayers under her breath. "Get out!" she screamed, dragging me from the room. As we fled, the shadows receded, retreating back into the mirror. The last thing I saw before the door slammed shut was my own reflection, staring back at me with hollow, desperate eyes. Mrs. Carmichael explained that she had kept Henry's key all these years, knowing that one day someone like me would come along, someone too curious for their own good. "I couldn't let you face it alone," she said. "But you've unleashed something that won't rest until it's claimed another soul." I moved out the next day, but the nightmares followed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room, staring into the mirror, watching as my reflection reached for me. And now, even in the daylight, I hear it, the knocking. Always in threes, 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I ran or how fiercely I tried to deny its presence. The knocking followed me to every new apartment, every city I fled to. It was no longer confined to the dead of night, it echoed in the quiet moments of my days, cutting through the hum of traffic or the chatter of strangers. My sleep became fractured and restless. Dreams bled into reality, and I began to lose my grip on what was real. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and my reflection in windows or mirrors lingered a moment too long after I turned away. Mrs. Carmichael tried to warn me. After the incident, she left several messages on my phone, her voice growing more urgent with each one. "You mustn't ignore it," she pleaded in the last message. "The knocking is a warning. It's trying to tell you something." I didn't return her calls. I couldn't. I was too ashamed, too terrified of what I'd unleashed. But deep down, I knew she was right. The knocking wasn't just a random phenomenon, it was connected to something bigger, something I didn't understand. I threw myself into researching Henry Grayson, scouring every record, every forgotten article, hoping to find a clue, a way to sever the connection between myself and the last room. The more I read, the clearer it became that Henry had been consumed by his own creation. His paintings weren't just art, they were a medium. A bridge to another realm. I tracked down one of his surviving pieces, a grotesque painting titled The Endless Doorway. It depicted a shadowy figure standing before a door identical to the one in my apartment, its form dissolving into the darkness as if being pulled inside. The gallery owner, an elderly man with trembling hands, refused to speak about it. When I pressed him, he muttered a single phrase before ushering me out: "The door doesn't open, it consumes." One evening, as I sat in my dimly lit apartment, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and faded photographs, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't the rhythmic knocking from the last room. This was real, immediate. I hesitated, my heart pounding. When I finally opened the door, I found a man standing there. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and sunken as if he hadn't slept in years. His dark eyes seemed to see straight through me. "You've seen it," he said without introduction. His voice was low, gravelly, and eerily calm. "Seen what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The last room," he replied. "And now it sees you." He introduced himself as Nathan, a paranormal researcher who had been tracking cases tied to Henry Grayson's work. He knew about the room, the knocking, the mirror. He knew about the whispers in the dark and the feeling of being watched. Nathan believed that Henry hadn't just trapped something in that room, he had invited it in. The entity wasn't just a shadow or a ghost. It was something far older, something that fed on fear and curiosity, growing stronger with every soul it ensnared. Nathan had a plan. He claimed that the only way to break the connection was to return to the room and confront the entity directly. It sounded insane, but by this point, I was desperate. The knocking was growing louder, more insistent. My reflection had begun to change in subtle but horrifying ways, its expression darker. Its movement slower, as if it were waiting for the right moment to break free. We returned to the apartment under the cover of night. Nathan carried a leather-bound journal filled with notes, symbols, and incantations. He handed me a small mirror, its edges lined with intricate carvings. "This will show you the truth," he said cryptically. As we stepped inside, the air grew heavy, thick with the same oppressive energy I'd felt that first night. The door to the last room loomed at the end of the hallway, its polished handle glinting in the dim light. Nathan began to chant, his voice steady but strained. The words were unfamiliar, a mix of Latin and something older. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the walls vibrating as if alive. The door swung open on its own, revealing the dark, suffocating space beyond. The mirror on the far wall was no longer cracked, it was whole, its surface shimmering like liquid. Shadows writhed around it, taking on vague, humanoid shapes that reached out with clawed hands. "Step forward," Nathan instructed, his voice firm. I hesitated but obeyed, clutching the small mirror tightly. As I approached the large mirror, my reflection shifted. It was no longer me, it was the shadowy figure from Henry's painting, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Why do you torment me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The reflection smiled, a cruel, mocking grin. "I am not tormenting you," it said. "You called me. You broke the seal. Now, I am free." The shadows surged forward, but Nathan shouted an incantation, and the small mirror in my hand began to glow. The light intensified, forcing the shadows to retreat. The reflection screamed, its form dissolving into the swirling darkness. When it was over, the last room was empty. The mirror was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor. The oppressive energy had lifted. Replaced by an eerie stillness, Nathan explained that the small mirror had acted as a vessel, trapping the entity once again. But he warned me that it was only a temporary solution. The entity was patient, and it would wait for another opportunity to escape. I moved out the next day, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. But the experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of the dangers that lie just beyond the veil of our reality. Even now, I can't look at a closed door without feeling a pang of dread. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I still hear it, the faint, rhythmic knocking, as if calling me back. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. Story 5. The haunting of Greystone Manor. Greystone Manor was not just an ordinary house. Nestled in a secluded countryside, it stood amidst dense forests, where cold winds howled through the trees, carrying with them dark clouds and flickering lights. Built at the end of the 19th century, this grand estate had witnessed many generations live and die within its walls, all haunted by inexplicable, eerie events. At first, I didn't believe in the stories about the house. As a logical person, I wasn't quick to believe in the supernatural. I arrived with an open mind, but also a sense of caution. A friend had recommended me for this job, managing an old estate. They needed someone to help maintain and protect it before it fell into disrepair. On my first day at Greystone Manor, everything was eerily calm. I walked through its long hallways, admiring the paintings on the walls and the antique furniture, which seemed impossible to find in modern homes. Everything appeared perfect, too perfect to be real. But as night fell, things began to change. When the lights dimmed, it felt as though the shadows took over, and the cold wind whispered through the windows like an unsettling secret. Strange noises echoed from above, soft footsteps, as though someone was walking in the dark. It was too quiet, yet suffocating. One night, while I was in the library, researching the house's history, I noticed a large painting hanging on the wall, an image of a woman with cold, haunting eyes. The former occupants told me it was the portrait of Eleanor Gray, the house's previous owner. They said she had died in a mysterious accident years ago, and ever since then, the house had never known peace. A chill ran through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze was still fixed upon me. One evening, I decided to inspect the upper floors. As I walked down the corridor, I heard a door creak open slowly. I turned around, but no one was there. However, a door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. I entered, and as I did, a cold gust of wind rushed in, scattering books from the desk. Everything was silent until I saw something in the mirror, a figure standing behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. This began to happen regularly. I started to question my sanity, but the strange occurrences only became clearer. Things around me began to move on their own. Doors would open and close without being touched. And each night, I heard footsteps in the forbidden rooms. Eventually, I decided to learn more about Eleanor Gray, the woman who had died in this house. What I uncovered kept me glued to the old books in the library. Eleanor Gray was no ordinary woman. The documents I found revealed that she had been involved in occult practices, convinced that through certain rituals, she could preserve her life forever. One night, unable to take it any longer, I decided to go to the room at the very top of the house, the one where it was said Eleanor Gray performed her final ritual. There, I found an old altar, surrounded by strange objects. A book lay open on the table, almost as though it was waiting for me. As I looked at the pages, I saw strange symbols and ancient incantations. Just then, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around but saw no one. But I could feel an eerie presence, as if someone was watching me. Then, I saw her, a figure of a woman, dressed in a long white gown, standing in the corner of the room, her cold eyes fixed on me. When I tried to speak, she remained silent, and in the air, I felt a chill as if time itself had stopped. Without warning, she moved toward me, and I heard a faint voice in the wind, "Now, it's time for you to join me." A wave of terror surged through me, and I knew I had to do something. Grabbing the book in my hand, I began to recite the incantations I had discovered in the ancient texts. As I spoke each word, strange lights surrounded me, and Eleanor's figure began to fade. The whispers and voices that had haunted the house started to recede. Finally, she vanished, and the room fell silent. The next day, I left Greystone Manor. Though I couldn't explain everything that happened, I knew one thing: not all houses are what they seem. And sometimes, the mysteries will never be fully explained. Greystone Manor still stands, waiting for someone to dare enter and continue the journey into the unknown. Days passed, but the memory of that night in Greystone Manor lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. The house had seemed so alive, so real, but now, it felt like a mere echo of what it had once been. Yet, there were still questions. Unanswered questions that gnawed at me, deep within my soul. I returned to the manor shortly after, unable to shake off the strange pull I felt toward it. Despite what had happened, I couldn't leave it alone. The air around the estate felt different now, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a living entity, a creature made of walls, halls, and dark memories. The first thing I noticed when I returned was the strange silence. The sounds of the manor, creaking floors, faint whispers, the rustling of the wind in the trees, had stopped. It was as though time itself had frozen, leaving the house in a still, unnatural quiet. But deep down, I knew it was far from peaceful. The strange occurrences resumed as soon as I stepped inside. At first, it was little things. An object moved from one place to another, books disarranged on the shelves, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. But soon, things grew more sinister. One night, I heard footsteps behind me as I walked down a long hallway. I turned around quickly, only to find no one there. And then, as if in answer, the door at the end of the hall slammed shut on its own. I wasn't alone in that house. I ventured into the library once more, hoping to find answers in the old books. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me as I read through the dusty, yellowed pages. As I turned each page, the words seemed to come alive, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. There was a ritual described in one of the ancient texts, a ritual that seemed to speak directly to me. It was a way to free the trapped souls in Greystone Manor. But it came with a cost. It said that Eleanor Gray, the woman whose spirit tormented the house, had never truly died. Her ritual, meant to preserve her life, had failed. Instead of achieving immortality, she had bound herself to the house, creating a vortex of restless energy. The ritual I was reading about could break that curse, but it came at a great price. The price was not just a life, but a soul. The more I read, the more the house seemed to react. The walls trembled, the lights flickered, and I heard whispers, soft at first, like a distant voice, and then louder, as though the house was trying to speak to me. But it wasn't just the house. It was Eleanor, still trapped inside. Still trying to reach out, I gathered my courage and headed up to the top floor, where the ritual was said to have been performed. As I ascended the stairs, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. The air was thick, and every step seemed to bring me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. The top floor was dark, and the only light was the dim glow of a flickering candle placed on the altar. The cold, damp stone walls closed in around me, and I could almost hear Eleanor's voice calling out to me. "Help me," she whispered, but it was not her voice. It was something else, something darker, more sinister. It was a plea for salvation, but it felt more like a demand. I couldn't turn back now. The ritual had to be completed. I placed my hands on the altar, the book opened before me, and I began to chant the words. As I spoke the incantations, I felt the temperature drop, the shadows around me deepening. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, I felt myself slipping into a trance-like state. I could see her, Eleanor Gray, standing in front of me, her once beautiful face twisted in agony. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth stretched into a silent scream. "You should never have come here," she whispered, her voice now a hiss, full of malice. "You don't understand what you've awakened." The room shook violently, and I could feel the power of the house, of Eleanor's curse, seeping into my bones. I struggled to keep chanting, to finish the ritual, but the force trying to stop me was overwhelming. It felt as though the very air was alive, wrapping around me, trying to suffocate me. Just as I thought I couldn't continue, something changed. A bright light erupted from the book in my hands, blinding me for a moment. I felt a pressure lift from my chest, and the house seemed to exhale a long, shuddering breath. The walls groaned, and the temperature rose, the cold finally dissipating. The whispers faded, and I knew then that I had done it. I had freed her. But not without a cost. As I looked around, the shadows seemed to recede, and the house grew still. The presence of Eleanor was gone, replaced by a sudden, eerie calm. I could still hear the echoes of her voice, faint whispers of gratitude. But she was no longer bound to the manor. She was free, and so was I, but as I turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of something. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. I knew, even though she was free, a part of her remained in that place, forever bound to the house, waiting for someone else to take her place. And in that moment, I realized the truth. Greystone Manor would never truly be free. I left the house behind me, but I could never truly leave it. Its shadows would follow me for the rest of my life, and sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can hear her voice again, "Help me." It had been days since the ritual, yet the weight of Greystone Manor still lingered on my mind like an unshakable presence. Despite having freed Eleanor from her torment, I couldn't escape the unnerving feeling that the house had left an imprint on me, an indelible mark on my very soul. It was as if the mansion itself had come alive in my memory, its rooms, halls, and long-forgotten corridors haunting my every thought. The pull was stronger than ever, and though I had broken the curse, I was still drawn to the manor. I found myself returning to Greystone, almost unconsciously. I didn't plan on it, but the thought of revisiting felt like the only way to truly understand what I had done and whether it was enough to end the dark legacy of the house. I arrived late one evening, just as twilight descended, casting long shadows across the mansion's once pristine grounds. The air felt thick and humid, heavy with anticipation. The large oak doors creaked as I pushed them open. And once again, the silence of the house enveloped me. It was different this time, quieter, but there was an energy, something elusive and unsettling, lingering in the atmosphere. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. I walked through the entrance hall once more, the floorboards groaning under my feet as though welcoming me back. The familiar creaking of the mansion's skeleton filled the air, but there was no sign of the chilling cold that had once pervaded the place. The house felt warmer now, more alive. But the energy was off, like something was watching me from just beyond the edge of my vision. The walls had shifted too. The ornate wallpaper, once faded and peeling, now seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, as if they were hiding something beneath. My curiosity tugged at me, urging me to search deeper, to explore more thoroughly. I was compelled to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply buried. I ascended the staircase, my footsteps echoing eerily through the vast emptiness of the hall. As I passed by the old portraits of the Grey family, something strange happened. One of the paintings, the one of Eleanor herself, seemed to shift. The eyes of the painted figure blinked. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the smile that graced her lips curled into something far more sinister. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. This was impossible. I had freed her. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only scratched the surface of something much darker than I could have ever imagined. I made my way to the library once more, drawn by an almost magnetic force. The large oak door creaked open as I entered, and the smell of dust and old paper filled my lungs. The bookshelves stretched up to the high ceilings, filled with yellowing pages and forgotten knowledge. It felt like this room held more secrets than the rest of the house combined. I ran my fingers over the spines of the books, each one a piece of history, a whisper from the past. One book in particular caught my eye, a thick, leather-bound tome that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It was the same book I had used to perform the ritual to free Eleanor. But this time, it was different. As I opened the pages, the words on the yellowed paper began to shift, rearranging themselves into something new. The symbols on the pages seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and as I read the words, I realized they were not a description of a ritual but a warning. This book, I realized, was far older than I had first thought. It was not a simple guide to break a curse, it was a manual for creating one. A warning, yes, but also a prophecy. It spoke of a ritual, much darker and more complex, one that could bind the souls of not just one person, but an entire family. And as I read the words, it became clear, Eleanor had never been the only one trapped in the house. Her spirit was merely the most restless, the most desperate to break free. But she wasn't alone. The other souls, those who had once lived in the manor, whose names had been lost to history, were still there, wandering the halls, tethered to the place by a curse far older and more powerful than I could have imagined. The ritual I had performed, while freeing Eleanor, had not been enough to sever the bonds completely. It had merely shifted the curse, moving it from one spirit to another. As I read on, the words twisted into a prophecy about the future of the manor, a future in which the curse would never truly end, where the souls of the Grey family would continue to roam, forever bound to the house. The final pages were blank, but I could feel the weight of them. The silence in the room grew oppressive, as though the house was watching me, waiting for me to make a choice. I closed the book with trembling hands, my mind racing. The house was far from free, and the curse was far from over. My attempt to end it had only been a temporary reprieve. I realized then that I had two choices: to leave, to walk away and let the house claim its next victim, or to go deeper, to uncover the full extent of the curse and finish what I had started. I decided to stay. I ventured further into the house, past rooms that felt unnaturally cold, past dark corners that seemed to breathe with malevolent energy. And then, in the deepest part of the manor, I found it. A door, hidden behind a false wall in the basement, leading to a chamber I had never seen before. Inside, there was a circle drawn on the floor in what appeared to be blood, old, darkened blood that had long since dried. The walls were covered in strange symbols, ones I had seen in the book. But this room was different. It was the heart of the curse, and there, in the center of the room, stood a figure, a woman, draped in white, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. It was Eleanor, or what was left of her. Her once beautiful form was now twisted and gaunt, her body racked with the agony of centuries spent trapped in the house. She reached out toward me, her hands clawing at the air as if begging for release, but this was no longer just Eleanor. This was the curse itself, an ancient force that had taken on a life of its own. Growing stronger with each passing year, I knew what I had to do. I spoke the incantation, the final words from the book, and as I did, the room trembled. The very foundation of Greystone Manor shook with a power so immense that I could barely stand. The figure of Eleanor wailed in agony, her form twisting and distorting as the curse fought back. But I didn't stop. I finished the chant, the words tumbling from my lips despite the growing terror inside me, and then, with one final, deafening roar, the curse was broken, the house went silent. The air grew still. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The oppressive presence. The dark energy that had held the manor in its grip, vanished. Eleanor's twisted form disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a faint, fading whisper of her once grateful voice. As the silence of the manor enveloped me, a strange calm washed over my mind. The once oppressive weight of the house seemed to dissipate, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that I had only scratched the surface. The curse had been broken, yes, but the house's grip on me, on anyone who had dared to enter, was far from over. Greystone Manor had lived through centuries of torment, and its walls had witnessed things that no human should ever lay eyes on. With the last echoes of Eleanor's distorted cries fading into nothingness, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The mansion felt different now, but it also felt, waiting. As if it were anticipating something, as though my presence was still a key in an ever-turning lock. I walked through the halls slowly, unsure whether I had actually freed myself from the curse or merely delayed its inevitable return. The air was warmer than it had been before, but still thick with the energy of the house. The wallpaper, though once discolored and peeling, seemed to glow faintly now. As though the mansion itself were breathing, alive with its own spirit, the hallway stretched before me, the doors to rooms I hadn't dared enter now beckoning me with an irresistible pull. I stopped at the end of the hallway, before a large, imposing door, the one I had avoided earlier. The same door that had once been locked with a heavy, rusted padlock. I felt a strange sense of inevitability, as though this door held the final piece of the puzzle. The last fragment of a story that had begun long before my arrival. The history of Greystone Manor was incomplete, and I was now the one meant to complete it. I reached for the door handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through my hand as I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a grand room filled with dust and cobwebs. But what struck me the most was the smell, the distinct, metallic scent of something long forgotten. The room, though abandoned, seemed to hum with life, as if the very air within it was charged with a dark, electric energy. There, in the center of the room, stood an altar, a stone slab covered in strange, intricate symbols. This was no ordinary altar, it was something far older, far darker. The symbols were not of any language I had recognized before. They twisted and shifted on the stone, alive with an unsettling glow. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I approached. What could this altar mean? Was this the true source of the curse? Had it always been here, beneath my very feet, watching and waiting for the right moment to be uncovered? As I stood before it, a chilling thought crossed my mind. The curse might have been broken for Eleanor, but what if the source of the curse itself, this altar, had never truly been destroyed? What if the house had merely adapted to its new form, moving from one source of suffering to the next? I could feel my heart race as the room seemed to darken, the symbols on the altar pulsing with a life of their own. Before I could think any further, the floor beneath my feet gave a low groan, and the walls seemed to breathe. I could hear soft whispers now, just at the edge of my hearing. They were faint at first, but soon, they became louder, more insistent. The voices of the trapped souls, their sorrow, their pain. They were all around me, yet invisible, hidden in the shadows. I tried to step back, to leave the room, but my legs felt as though they were made of stone. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in the very place where the curse had originated. And then, from the shadows, I saw them, the figures. They were translucent at first, their outlines faint and indistinct. But as they stepped closer, they grew clearer, tall, thin figures draped in tattered, old clothing, their faces contorted with expressions of agony and despair. The ghosts of the Grey family, forever bound to the house by their own sins. They had been cursed to wander the halls of Greystone Manor for eternity, unable to find peace. One of the figures approached me, and I felt a cold chill run through me. The figure's face came into sharp focus, and I could see the twisted, anguished expression on its features. It was the face of a man, someone I didn't recognize, but whose eyes burned with the weight of guilt and regret. He reached out toward me with trembling hands, his fingers hovering just above my skin, and for the briefest moment, I could hear his voice, "Finish it." The words were barely audible, but they felt like a command, as if my very existence depended on my action. I couldn't move, couldn't respond, but the figure's gaze was filled with such intensity that I felt as though I had no choice. This was the moment of reckoning. The figure stepped back, his form dissolving into the shadows as the other spirits closed in. They were all around me now, their mournful cries echoing through the room. And then I realized, the ritual was far from over. What I had done for Eleanor was only the beginning. The house itself needed to be cleansed. I turned my gaze back to the altar, the dark symbols pulsing with a stronger, more feverish light. The realization hit me hard. The curse wasn't just bound to the spirits of the family, it was bound to the very foundation of the manor itself. And until it was destroyed, until the altar was obliterated, the spirits would never find rest. They would be trapped in this nightmare forever, unable to move on, just as the house had been unable to free itself from its own torment. I began to chant the words from the book again, but this time, they were different. The symbols on the altar seemed to respond to the power of my voice, shifting and changing as I spoke. I could feel the air around me crackling with energy. The spirits screamed louder, a cacophony of anguish that filled my ears, but I pushed on. Then, with a violent tremor, the altar erupted in a burst of light. The symbols disintegrated into nothingness, and the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The spirits, Eleanor included, screamed in agony, but I could feel them slowly fading away, their tortured souls released at last. The energy that had held them in place was unraveling. For a moment, everything was still. And then, as if in response to the destruction of the altar, Greystone Manor began to shift. The house groaned and creaked, its walls seeming to sag as if it were finally exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. The oppressive energy that had filled the house, the dark presence that had weighed on my chest, was gone. The spirits of the Gray family, those who had been trapped for so long, were free. I stumbled out of the room, my legs trembling, my mind spinning from the intensity of the ritual. As I stood at the threshold of the manor, staring back at the ruins of the altar, I realized that Greystone Manor was no longer the house of despair it had once been. The curse had been broken, truly broken, and the souls that had been trapped there were finally at peace. But even as I left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it would always be a part of me. The shadows of Greystone Manor, the whispers of the spirits, would forever haunt my memory. I had freed them, yes, but their stories, their struggles, would live on in the corners of my mind, long after I had left the house behind, and somewhere, deep within, I knew that I had not merely been an observer in this dark history. I had been part of it, my actions, my choices, shaping the fate of the manor and its spirits. I had become a part of its story. Greystone Manor had given me a gift, and a curse, all at once. The sunlight that filtered through the dense clouds above Greystone Manor seemed almost surreal as I stood on the threshold, staring back at the decaying mansion. The house, once so oppressive, now seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, its towering structure weakened by centuries of secrets, bloodshed, and sorrow. The sense of heaviness that had hung in the air was gone, but it left a peculiar stillness in its wake, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Unsure of its new reality, I stepped away from the manor, my feet moving almost of their own accord as I walked through the overgrown garden that led to the front gate. The leaves on the trees swayed gently in the breeze. A stark contrast to the haunting stillness of the house behind me. It was as though the world outside had moved on, while the manor remained frozen in time. As I reached the gate, I paused. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me, soft, slow, deliberate. I turned around sharply, expecting to see someone. But there was no one. Just the manor, looming behind me like a sleeping beast. I felt an odd pull in my chest, as if something inside me was tethered to the house, unwilling to let go. The spirits had been freed, yes, but the house itself, was it truly at peace? I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. Something left unfinished, some part of the story that had yet to be revealed. I walked toward my car, my mind racing. I had seen the spirits fade away, heard their cries diminish to nothingness. But still, there was a void inside me, a gnawing emptiness. I knew, deep down, that the house had shared its secrets with me, its deepest, darkest secrets. But I had yet to uncover everything it had hidden. The drive back was a blur. I passed through towns and winding roads, but it all felt distant, like I was moving through a dream. The events of the past few days, no, weeks, seemed to be a distant memory, disconnected from the present moment. My mind kept replaying the visions of the spirits, their anguish, their despair. I had been their savior, their deliverer. But who would deliver me from the aftermath? The weight of the house's history had left an indelible mark on me. I could feel it deep within, like a shadow that refused to leave my side. When I arrived back at my apartment, I went straight to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the spirits, their eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. I saw Eleanor's face, her twisted smile fading as she disappeared into the ether. And then I saw the altar, the dark symbols, pulsing with an energy that seemed to reach out to me, even from beyond the grave. I lay there for hours, tossing and turning, until finally, I drifted into an uneasy slumber. The dream came again. It was the same one I had experienced the night before I left Greystone Manor. I found myself standing in the very heart of the house, in that dark, cold room with the altar. But this time, there was no release. The spirits, the Gray family, were still there. And they were looking at me, not with gratitude, but with something else. Something darker. Their eyes were no longer filled with sorrow, but with anger, fury at the life they had been condemned to. Fury at me for disturbing their slumber. I reached out to them, but they recoiled, their forms shifting and warping before my eyes. The house trembled, as if it were coming alive, and the floor beneath me cracked open. I fell into the abyss, the dark shadows swallowing me whole. I awoke with a start, my breath coming in short gasps. The room was still, the silence deafening. But it felt different now, heavier. I could feel the presence of something watching me from the corner of the room. I glanced toward the window, but the moonlight shining through was faint, barely enough to cast a shadow. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the unsettling feeling, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had been marked. The spirits, though free, had left something behind. Their curse was no longer confined to Greystone Manor. It had followed me. I could feel it crawling under my skin, like a parasite that had embedded itself in my soul. The house was not just a building, it was a living entity, a vessel of suffering, a keeper of secrets. And now, it had claimed me as one of its own. I thought back to the words of the man I had encountered, the one who had warned me before I ventured into the manor. He had spoken of an ancient power, of a curse that could never truly be broken. I had dismissed his warnings then, thinking them to be the ramblings of a madman. But now, I knew better. Greystone Manor was far more than just a haunted house, it was a living thing, an entity that had existed long before the Grey family had ever stepped foot in it, and I was tied to it now. I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself it was just a nightmare, that the curse had ended with the destruction of the altar. But as the days passed, the feeling lingered. The nightmares continued, each one growing more intense, more real. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing whispers just beyond my reach. The house had a hold on me, and no matter where I went. It followed. One evening, I decided to return to the manor. I didn't know why. Perhaps I was hoping to find answers, or maybe I just needed closure. But as I stood at the gates of Greystone Manor once more, I could feel the weight of its presence. The air was thick, heavy, and the house seemed to be watching me. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I walked through the halls, each step bringing me closer to the truth. But what truth would I find here? I had already broken the curse, had already freed the spirits. Was I just chasing a phantom? The grand room with the altar lay just as I had left it, but it was different now. The once dark symbols were gone, replaced by something new, something worse. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. The spirits, Eleanor, the Grey family, were gone, but the house itself remained. And it was not finished with me. I felt a presence, a cold, palpable force that seemed to seep into my very bones. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure I had seen before, the one with the anguished face. It was the man from my dream, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He reached out toward me, his fingers brushing against my skin, sending a chill through my body. "You cannot escape," he whispered, his voice low and mournful. "The house will always claim its own," and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The house seemed to settle into an eerie silence, but I knew with every fiber of my being, that the curse had not been lifted. It had only changed forms. And now, it was part of me. Forever. And so, as the night deepens and the shadows stretch long, remember, not all is as it seems. The world is full of secrets, and some of them might just be waiting for you when the darkness falls. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more haunting tales to guide you into a peaceful sleep, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us, and it motivates us to share more chilling stories that will keep you intrigued and relaxed. Now, as you close your eyes, let the sound of the rain and the whispers of the unknown lull you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sleep well, and remember, there's always a story to be told. Sweet dreams, and good night. Subscribe now, and let the next tale carry you into slumber.